Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. What type of government should the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the church be? Should we be chiefly in the power of the bishops collectively or even regionally? Or should the church be governed by an earthly monarch, aka the Pope? So this is a topic that's heatedly debated between Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox ever since the schism of 1054, and there seems to be no resolution in sight. The Eastern Orthodox claim that Peter was not given any power of authority over the other bishops. For the most part, that's what they claim, that he was first among equals. He's mentioned first, but that all of the other 11 apostles are co-equals with Peter as far as authority goes. There might be a few Oriental Orthodox that might say, yeah, initially Peter was giving a higher authority than the other 11 apostles, but over time the popes cease to act as St. Peter acts, so therefore they lost that primacy and authority, and therefore the patriarch, the regional patriarch, is given equal authority among other regional patriarchs and so forth. And then by extension, this kind of goes into the Presbyterians, who don't call their patriarch a bishop, they call them elders and so forth. And it gets into the Calvinist model of an aristocracy of elders governing the church, and certainly not one man, because then the papacy would be valid and legitimate. And by golly, if you're not Roman Catholic, you can't have that, because otherwise you'd have to admit that the revolt against the Roman Catholic Church was erroneous and a usurpation of authority. You'd have to admit that. Well, in the late 16th century, St. Robert Bellarmine published this work, and he refutes the arguments of the Protestants and the Eastern Orthodox one by one. He takes each argument and he refutes it, giving sources from the Bible and also from the early church fathers, and sometimes by philosophers and by reason. So here he's going to focus on, first he's going to refute the argument that the ecclesiastical government ought not to be in the power of the bishops collectively, and then he goes on to demonstrate why it should be a monarchy. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water. Very hot right now and dry. Not dry, but hot. My mouth is dry. Okay, so let us begin. Quote, "The third proposition follows, which teaches that the government of the church should not chiefly be in the power of bishops and priests, against two errors of Calvin. The first error of Calvin is that bishops and priests are equal by divine law, while the second is the supreme power in the church resides in the body of elders. Jan Hus held to the same error, which can be understood from the condemnations of the Council of Constance. Now the first error in that disputation will be more appropriately refuted in the disputation on clergy, and we will take it up in its proper place. In the meantime, it will be enough to refute the first error from the one that follows. Accordingly, these two errors are opposed among themselves. If the church is ruled by aristocrats, as the second error would have it, certainly priests are not aristocrats. But if priests are aristocrats, then the church is not ruled by aristocrats, since it is certain that there were never priests present in general councils, wherein the administration of the whole church was conducted with the authority to define, and where laws were imposed or abrogated whereby the church is ruled, unless they were legates, and they held the place of some bishops. That is not necessary to prove otherwise than the very acts of the councils, which are still extant," meaning the available resources on the councils will tell you that there were no common priests unless they were sent by the bishop to represent them at the councils. Continuing, quote, "Really the second error, which is more properly to this argument, is confounded for these reasons. First, it is never read in the scriptures that supreme power was conferred upon a council of priests. Whatever authority was conceded to the apostles and the rest of the disciples by Christ was conceded not only to all of them, but even to them as individuals, and it was not necessary to exercise it in council. Indeed, individual apostles, and without a doubt individual bishops, could and can even now teach, baptize, loose, bind, ordain ministers, etc. The only passage is Matthew 18, where something is attributed to a council when it is said, quote, "Where there will have been 2 or 3 gathered in my name, there I am in their midst," close quote, from Matthew 18. What the power of a council might actually consist of, however, whether it is supreme, medium, or lowest, shall not be explicated here. Calvin himself does not make much of this reference in the Gospel, to the point that he would say that it is nothing less than for whatever particular body you like to meet, and not a general council. For that reason we shall not labor much on this argument at present. Secondly, if supreme power of governance were in the hands of aristocrats, it would follow that the church would almost always lack rulers, and most of all, there would be no one who would take care of the common good. Hence the ecclesiastical commonwealth would be very miserable, as indeed aristocrats would be equal amongst themselves, as is proper, and could not administer the common good unless they were either gathered together, or choose by a common consensus some magistrate, whom they would all obey, in the fashion in which the Romans elected their councils. But in the church, aristocrats are rarely gathered in a general council. For the first 300 years there was no general council, afterwards scarcely every 100 years, but a magistrate, whom the universal church would obey, at least for a time, was never created by these aristocrats, for if they would create someone, he would most likely be one of the 5 patriarchs, who were always prominent in the church. But our adversaries contend that the Roman patriarch never had this power. From the other 4, this business is very certain. The patriarch of Alexandria never had this power outside of Egypt, nor the others outside of their regions. This is why St. Jerome asked, quote, "Tell me what in Palestine pertains to the bishop of Alexandria." And Chrysostom, who was asked about Theophilus, the patriarch of Alexandria, who was conducting ecclesiastical business outside of his province, said, "It is not right that those who are in Egypt should judge those who are in Thrace. How absurd would this be if the Catholic Church, which is so truly one, that in the Scriptures it should be called one city, one house, one body, but would have no one on earth who might take care of it? Who can't see it? For if particular churches were not so united in themselves that they formed one body, it would suffice that each were its own ruler. But they could no more lack an individual ruler than one flock can lack a shepherd, and one body its head. Thirdly, if supreme power should be in a body of aristocrats, in which there were a greater number compelled to attend a council, so much greater would be the authority, in that it could never turn out that more authority could be given to a council attended by fewer persons than one attended by more. But if the council of Rimini was attended by 600 bishops, and has never been held to have had authority in the Catholic Church, the first council of Constantinople, on the other hand, had 450 bishops, and has always been held to have enjoyed the greatest authority. And we recall for this sake of the present controversy, because that was called by the Pope, whose supreme power in the Church has been rejected by our adversaries. Moreover, those who grant supreme power in the Church to aristocrats can offer no reasons why they condemn the Council of Rimini, but embrace the Council of Constantinople. But they say the Council of Rimini erred, while the first Council of Constantinople did not. On that account they embrace the latter and condemn the former. But what else is this than to make oneself the judge of the councils and of the whole church? Close quote. So what he's saying here is that even if authority were given equally to aristocrats, they would still have to make a judgment if they couldn't all agree on certain thing. There'd have to be at least a tiebreaker or some forth. And then Robert Bellarmine, he compares 2 councils, one of Rimini, which had 600 bishops in attendance, which was rejected, and another of Constantinople, which only had 450 bishops. They say that one is legitimate and the other one is illegitimate. And if you press them why, you say, well, Rimini had errors in it, but Constantinople did not. But as Bellarmine rightly points out, that in order for one to make a decision on that, if it weren't decided by one person, then that individual would have to look at both councils and decide for himself. So he's taking the authority as if he were pope to decide which he's going to accept and which he is not. And the Council of Constantinople, furthermore, was called by the pope. So they would have to at least concede that he had the authority to call a council, which in the present day, the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't really have, no one has the authority to call a council, so therefore they cannot resolve any issues when one patriarch excommunicates the other, which is currently the case with Constantinople and Moscow. But I digress. Continuing, quote, fourthly, although democracy is absolutely the worst form of government, nevertheless it appears more pernicious for the Church than aristocracy. Accordingly, the worst thing for the Church is heresy. Heresies, however, are more often excited amongst the aristocrats than amongst the common faithful. Certainly, almost all heresiarchs are either bishops or priests. As a result, heresies are almost like factions amongst the aristocrats, without which there would be no sedition in the Church of the people. But factions never arise more easily or frequently than when aristocrats rule, as can be proved not merely from example, and from the testimony of the philosophers, but even from the confession of Calvin himself. But our adversaries object, based on the testimony of 3 scriptures, joined even to 3 witnesses of the fathers. The first is Acts chapter 15, where we read that the first controversy of the church arose and was defined not by some individual supreme judge, but by the agreement of the apostles and the elders. Quoting, they agreed, the apostles and the elders, to consider on this word. I respond. Bellarmine responds. Here, no argument can be asserted for aristocracy. In fact, in that very council where the first question was defined, Peter was the president and head, nor in reality would Peter, who was in someone else's diocese, whose bishop, James, was present, dare to have spoken first, except that he was in charge of the whole council. Moreover, it is not opposed to monarchy that something would be decided upon in public assembly by the common council and agreement of princes, in the same manner as is usually happened in imperial assemblies at this time. Close quote. Okay, so first, Bellarmine argues, and it's obvious when you know your history, that most heresies and heresiarchs don't come from the laity and a common person. It's some quote-unquote aristocrat, some bishop or priest who has a good following. He makes a proposition, and his popularity gives him the confidence that he can proceed with his heresy and try to make changes in the church. And you can go through the history, and that's from Arius to Luther. That's always the case. Nearly always, virtually always. And then Bellarmine goes against some of the scriptural arguments by the Protestants, saying that Acts chapter 15 proved that it was a council and not Peter who decided what was what and defined what. And some might even say that James was the presider of the council, being the bishop of Jerusalem. But Bellarmine counters by saying Peter was the one who spoke first, and it was his argument that persuaded the council to rule in favor of what Peter and Paul were arguing, that Gentiles did not have to become Jews in order to become Christians. Okay, continuing. Quote, the second testimony is in Acts chapter 20, where St. Paul admonishes the bishops with these words, attend also to your whole flock, wherein the Holy Spirit has placed you as bishops to rule the church of God. The third is in 1 Peter chapter 5, where St. Peter speaks thus, I exhort the elders who are among you as fellow elders and witnesses of the passion of Christ, pasture the flock of God which is among you. Bellarmine responds, quote, neither citation proves anything. Truly we do not deny that bishops and priests come together, and that they should feed and rule the church of God. But our question is on the supreme power of the whole church. Does it reside in the body of ministers or in some individual man? In these citations, neither Paul nor Peter touches on this question. Rather, they merely admonish bishops to rigorously exercise their pastoral office for the people. They already brought from the fathers that first citation of Cyprian, who wrote to a cleric, such a matter, from Cyprian, that St. Cyprian, quote, such a matter, although I have determined that it considers the council and opinion of us all, I do not make bold to claim every matter to merely decide by myself." Close quote. Bellarmine responds, "Cyprian did not dare to render judgment because he had obliged himself of his own will when he received the episcopacy, that he was to do nothing without the counsel and consensus of the priests and the people, as we taught from above in the same book." Next they bring Ambrose, who said, quote, "Both the synagogue and afterward the church had elders, without whose counsel nothing was done." Close quote. Bellarmine responds, "No more from these words can ecclesiastical aristocracy be approved than from the existence of a senate and royal council in a kingdom that there is no monarchy. Certainly even Solomon had a body of elders by councils, and also Xerxes used counsel of the wise in all affairs. Nevertheless, it does not follow that they were not kings. On that account, because the old bishops would do nothing without the council of priests, with respect to what was advantage and salutary, still it was not necessary, nor can it be understood from that citation that at the time of Ambrose, were this not to be done, that the church would have ceased to exist." Lastly, they produce Jerome, who said, quote, "By the inspiration of the devils, some became zealous in religion, and even said among the people, I am of Paul, I am of Apollo, but I of Cephas. They were governed by the common council of priests and of the church. Yet afterward, when everyone began to consider those whom had baptized as his own, not Christ's, it was decreed in the whole world that one chosen among the priests should be placed above the rest, to whom all the care of the church belonged, and so the seeds of schismatics were abolished." Therefore, they argue, in the first period of the church, which I readily grant was the purest, aristocracy flourished and the priests were aristocrats. Bellarmine responds, "It seems that St. Jerome was of that opinion which reckons that bishops, if it is a question of jurisdiction, are indeed greater priests, but with respect to ecclesiastical law, not divine law. Such an opinion is false, and must be refuted in its place." Meanwhile, this was in no way advances that aristocracy of priests which Calvin holds to, but considerably strikes against it. For Jerome does not say that in the first age of the church an aristocracy of priests flourished, and that it was good government, but little by little, afterwards, through some abuse, monarchy was introduced by wicked men. Rather, he affirms, on the contrary, that there was an aristocracy in the beginning, but since it was not advancing well, and thereupon many seditions and schisms arose by the common council of the whole world, it was changed into a monarchy. Nor can there be any doubt whether Jerome would have taken notice that this change came to pass in the times of the apostles, and from those apostolic authors. In this citation he says then a change occurred, when it began to be said, quote, "I am of Paul, I of Apollo," as Paul witnesses what happened in his own time in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Next, Jerome says that James was the bishop of Jerusalem by the apostles immediately after the passion of the Lord, and asserts that St. Mark was the bishop of Alexandria. Add that Jerome does not speak about the universal government of the church, but only of particular places, when he says that from the beginning the churches began to be governed by the common council of priests. Besides, Peter was constituted as the head of the whole church, as the same Jerome teaches by the means of eloquent words, quoting, "From the 12 one is chosen, that being constituted as the head, the occasion of schism should be abolished." Close quote. So you see how the adversaries of the Roman Catholic Church do. They will quote our own early fathers against us, but they will quote it out of context. But when you read all of St. Jerome, Jerome himself says that Peter was chosen to be the head of that body. So just because it can be shown that there were councils of which bishops did have authority, and they were consultative by the Pope, they were consultative by Peter, and various kings like Solomon, Xerxes, and so forth of the past had elders and bodies of aristocracies which they would ask their councils. That doesn't negate that there was a monarchy in play. And the same goes for the Pope of Rome. Just because he does rely on the council of bishops and priests and cardinals and because he does have delegates, that doesn't lessen his authority anymore. So that's that. So I'm going to stop there because the next section of Robert Bellarmine of why the ecclesiastical government should be a monarchy is particularly long, and I fear that I would not be able to finish the whole session within the hour, so this should suffice for now. This shows that the arguments that the bishops should, collectively, or even with priests, form an aristocracy, and that is the supreme rule of the church. There's really not a lot of positive evidence for that case. I suppose that an argument might be made that if you go back into the Old Testament, in the Torah, that there was a patriarchal confederacy, a confederacy of patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel, and since the Torah is, at one time was the chief law of God and it represents his holy character, therefore an aristocracy of some sort or a patriarchal confederacy is the best form of government. And I suppose if you follow that logic, then you would be Eastern Orthodox, that regional jurisdiction, just like the 12 tribes of Israel were given certain regions of Israel and ruled over as a tribe. They would say that today the local bishop takes the place of the patriarch. But in the early church history, it's just not so, and Bellarmine will go on to demonstrate that quite easily. That Peter was chosen out of the 12 to be the head of the apostles, and the successors of Peter are the heads of the successors of the other apostles, the bishops. And that although bishops do have authority to rule their jurisdiction, their archdiocese and dioceses accordingly, they are subject to the Pope of Rome. And that will be determined quite easily as we go on. So please like this video, share it with your friends, please feel free to comment, and we will see you next time on Old World Order Theology. In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen.